Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome again for the second day of Port Talks, an online event is that for all customers and stakeholders of Port of Antwerp-Bruges. And today, ladies and gentlemen, we will talk about Port of Antwerp-Bruges as a green hub of the future, and we will take a closer look at a commercial outlook till 2025. Once again, we've invited top keynote speakers, and we'll have some panel discussions with experts. We kick off with the challenge of climate change. And both politicians and industry understand that change is needed for a really sustainable future. We need to move away from all the fossil fuels, you know that, to reach that goal of climate-neutral society. But how will Fit for 55, something we talked about yesterday, make that change possible? And even more, what will be the impact on the industry? Because the local supply of wind and solar energy will not be enough. And for our first keynote speaker knows all about it, as he was 8 years General Director of the Climate at the European Commission. Please welcome Professor at the European University Institute, Wouter Bleukx.
Good afternoon. Climate change is a very complex problem, and also the policy process related to it is very important. And when we read about it in the press and we talk about it, we confuse several phases. The problem defining, that is the task of the scientists. Then, on the basis of that, targets need to be defined. And we agreed targets at the level of the United Nations, and we have the Paris Agreement and COP26 that was really putting in shape commitments by almost all countries, but all G20 countries in the world. And then we have to translate that into policies. And these policies, that is exactly what the European Union is going to do, and is exactly what the next speaker, Tom van Ierland, is going to zoom in about. But even more important is, once the policies are defined, you have to implement the policies. And it needs a continuous monitoring on what goes well, what could be done better. And that is also what we learned since 2005 in the European Union. Now, let's zoom in on the problem. The science and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, created a consensus about what is happening. And what we are seeing happening is unprecedented. And it is due to human influence. Human influence, in two words, is the use of fossil fuels that we are using massively and increasingly since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So getting away from fossil fuels is the real task. And we are all involved, so all regions of the globe are involved. But let's look at the geological cycle that we are in today. We are at the end of the Holocene, and normally temperatures would have to come down. But you see on the slide that over the last 100 years, that red line up is indicating that the temperature increase was more than 1.2 degrees compared to when we started in the Industrial Revolution. So something is happening, not something only over last year, last decade, last centuries, but even in the geological cycle of the last 22,000 years. The point zero that you see on the screen, that is the time of the Romans and the Greeks, just to put it into perspective. So what we are experiencing is very dramatic and unseen before. But the brutal reality is that at the source of the problem are CO2 emissions. And CO2 emissions keep going up and up and up. And as you see in this, on the screen, we had a hope that around the 1980s, 1990s, we would see a leveling off of the emissions. But instead, what we saw is the red addition, the emerging economies starting to industrialize, and caused, on top of what we expected, an increase in greenhouse gas emissions that, as of now, has not yet come to an end. So there is a need for defining what we clearly can do, distributing the tasks between different countries in the world. And so when we look around, is the obvious questions: where are the emissions coming from? And the largest emitters today are, as you can see, China, the United States, and the EU. Now, China is by far the most and the biggest emitter due to the very intensive industrialization they went through over the last, say, quarter of a century. And that is a new element that was not around when the United Nations started to discuss about climate change in the 1990s. So that's a problem. And the quick answer of some is, let's target China. China is using a lot of coal, so China is the target and should do everything. It's not as simple as that. Because if we look at the emissions of greenhouse gases per person, we see that China is really on the average of what we are seeing today in the EU and elsewhere. And we see that in countries like India, that is also an emerging economy, the emissions per head are very low. Now, China and the EU has emissions per head that are quite comparable. But look at emitters like the United States and Canada and the oil-producing countries. Their emissions per head are scary high. So targeting the biggest polluter is one thing, but having an element of fairness on who is per head emitting the most brings another picture forward. And we have to complete that comparison in asking ourselves what, since the Industrial Revolution, has been emitted in an accumulative manner. And there the picture is even more daunting and comes back to us. Because the EU, the European continent, knew its Industrial Revolution first and continues to be a very important emitter. So when we put it in the historical context, we have a special responsibility in Europe that is shared with the United States, because we have, in an accumulated manner, been emitting the bulk of the greenhouse gas emissions as of today. So that brings a very complicated international debate. And we all know we have to do more. And we all know we have to reduce our emissions. That's what the scientists have told us. But when we look at where we are today, after the commitments and the pledges that were made at the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow last year, then we see that we are not yet doing enough. You see the dark red flashy difference. That is the difference between where we are today and what we should be doing. The dark green line is a stark reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and we are nowhere close to delivering that. At best, what we are doing, we are leveling off the emissions in the future. And as I was saying at the beginning, we have to reach a peak as soon as possible, and then consistently in all parts of the world starting to reduce our emissions. It's a daunting job. And it is a daunting job for which the European Union has been taking leadership, not only as a scientific contribution, but also in terms of policy experimentation. And that brings us to the question that is widely discussed in many circles. Europe takes an international leadership, but is Europe having a thought-through leadership? Is Europe really knowing what it is doing? Because in taking leadership, you have to be sure that there are followers. Now, Europe's international climate strategy is really enshrined in the multilateral approach that we need in the world, in the United Nations approach. That means we are all hanging together. We all have to do an effort. And by multilateral, Europe takes the lead, but forces also other countries, including the emerging economies, to take action. And that is the novelty of the Paris Agreement, unlike the Kyoto Protocol, that in the end, the Kyoto Protocol was asking only the industrialized nations to take serious action. Today, since the Paris Agreement, all countries have to take action. And Europe sees itself as a laboratory for low-carbon technologies and policies. And why is that? Well, I try to indicate that Europe has a particular responsibility, when it comes to climate change. We were at the birth of the Industrial Revolution, and we kept emitting greenhouse gas emissions for almost 3 centuries. So those suffering today from climate change are to a large extent suffering from the greenhouse gas emissions that came from the European continent. So we have a climate responsibility. But the good news is that we also see economic opportunity in tackling climate change. We are talking about new technologies. We are talking about having a standard of living without the emissions of greenhouse gases that we were seeing in the past. So economic opportunity is what brings us very much to the forefront of action in the world, because if the whole world agrees that climate change is a problem and the whole world agrees that it needs to be tackled, then those who have the technologies ready will have a good economic opportunity to transfer and benefit also economically from the transition that we have to go through. And basically, since we are seeing the war in Ukraine, an additional dimension has come to the fore, and that is the energy security. And what is energy security for Europe? It is reducing the dependence of fossil fuels, exactly the fossil fuels that we have to remove from our economic system. So the energy security dimension that was coming very brutally on the Europeans through the war in Ukraine adds another dimension why the climate and energy transition that we have been talking about for 1 to 2 decades needs to be accelerated even more, because our dependence on fossil fuels means an insecure European continent. So Europe's international climate strategy is a strategy that holds together. We take our responsibility, we use and try to take the benefits in terms of economic opportunity, and address a major issue of energy security that has come so clear since the war in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jas. Keep in mind that we are all in it together. We move on and we'll make this Fit for 55 even more concrete. Our second keynote will elaborate on the specific solutions from a political European angle and how it is possible to keep the international level playing field. May I have your attention, please, for the head of unit of the European Commission, Tom van Ierland.
Hello, welcome. Indeed, I will today present what you could call the framework of policies that we've put in place to direct our economy towards climate neutrality. That starts with the Green Deal. The Green Deal is an overarching policy devised by this Commission to make our economy more green. Climate transition makes a central part of that, and I've indicated it on my slide in red, which is the transition towards climate neutrality, but it's supported and helped by many different types of actions. And if you would read all the boxes in detail, you would find quite some policies that you might not identify immediately with climate change policy. Examples are farm to fork strategy, focused on the agriculture and food sector as a whole, policies around taxonomy and finance, trying to make our financial system more responsive to the needs of the climate transition. But of course, at the core, there are a number of energy, climate, transport, and industrial policies that will help us make the transformation. And that is where, and what is that transformation? Well, the transformation is one to go towards climate neutrality by 2050. I think the important notion here is that we will need to reduce emissions significantly. And that's what you see in the graph here, with the different sectors having to reduce emissions over time. Nevertheless, there are a few sectors where we expect that emissions will remain, and I think agriculture is an example where certain agricultural processes, such as the use of fertilizers, will always remain emitting. That raises the questions how to compensate those emissions that also cause climate change, and that is removals. removing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it. And I think that is at the heart of our transition towards climate neutrality. The first task is to reduce emissions significantly, and at the same time start developing the policies to also create removals, so that in the end, by 2050, our economy is a climate neutral one, where removals and emissions are in balance. That gets us to that trajectory. How do we get there? And I think that is the issue for the Fit for 55 package, which I will present in a second. That is to step up ambition, to put us on this more gradual trajectory towards 2050. In the graph here, as you see it, it is almost a linear line descending now all the way to 2050 to become climate neutral. The Fit for 55 package is a very broad package. It's not a single policy. It are multiple policies that combined, we hope, will make us step up our transition and be on that pathway towards climate neutrality. It has 13 interconnected proposals, and actually in the meantime, a number of additional proposals like the regulatory gas package have come out already that are also in support of this policy initiative. The 13 regulatory proposals are sometimes from a very different nature. Some of them impact pricing. They put a price on carbon or they put a price on energy. Some of them define targets, and these targets are often impacting our member states, setting an ambition level required for our member states to achieve in a certain sector or for a certain energy system. And then finally, there are a number of policies that are rules for, you could say, the companies bringing products to the market in the EU. And I think one of the best known is CO2 and cars, which is basically our policy at how CO2 efficient new cars need to be when they come to the EU economy. Finally, all of this benefits from what we see as support measures. We do understand that that transition is a transition that requires increased investments up front, with benefits coming through the lifetime of the investment. But there will be economic operators that will need an incentive and a support to make the investment. And we notably think, for instance, about low-income households, when you think about how households can make the transformation. But also industry, when you think about the innovative technologies that in the beginning are still more costly. And for that, there are different instruments in the package providing for support. Today, I focus on a subset of these policies, but the policies which I hope are of most interest for people operating in the port of Antwerp-Bruges. The first one I wanted to present is our emission trading system, the abbreviation being ETS. The emission trading system basically requires companies, large point sources who emit emissions, to own an amount of allowances equivalent to their emissions. If they, for some reason or another, lack them, they will need to acquire them on the market. If they can outperform, you could say, they can sell their allocations on the market. So it's a trading mechanism. It's operational. It covers at present all large industrial point sources. That's industry and power sector, basically. And it covers the aviation sector. What we propose now is to increase ambition, to go towards a target equivalent to 61% reductions by 2030 compared to 2005. And I think that's also important for the port, it proposes to include maritime. Maritime is at present not included. And the idea would be that all of the intra-EU emissions from maritime and all of the, 50% of the other emissions related to transport movements in and outside of the EU would be covered by the emission trading system. Maybe important in this context is to point out that we are aware that that's a policy that puts a price on carbon, and there could be other constituencies out there in other countries that are not faced with a similar constraint, and that creates the risk of carbon leakage. To address that, at present we have a tool called free allocation, where industrial sectors that are at risk of free allocation receive for free a number of allowances, decreasing over time based on benchmarks that basically reflect the best of the market. We are, in a way, tightening that system, strengthening the annual reduction of that free allocation, but also introducing a new mechanism. And I'll come back to that. That's the carbon border adjustment mechanism. We are changing the scope of the benchmarks, and in a way we will be allowing in the future to support also technologies that don't emit emissions, because to some extent today there are sectors where if you would produce a certain good without emissions at all, you might not get free allocation because you are categorized under a different industrial process. And examples are, for instance, green hydrogen. Finally, we put a conditionality. When you have energy audits as required under the energy efficiency directives, you will need to implement the most cost-efficient measures of these audits, otherwise you see a reduction in your free allocation. But I already introduced it, coming back to the new tool to address the risk on carbon leakage. The introduction of a CBAM, or Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. The idea is to gradually ensure that imports of industrial products coming into the EU have a similar or face a similar carbon price as EU industry. That is quite important to stress. It needs to be similar. That also means that actually in Europe we will start to phase out for those sectors the free allocation. So that in a very gradual way those sectors will be fully confronted with the carbon price and don't get initially free allocation for production. That would be very gradual. As I said, we plan to only have full auctioning for those sectors by 2035. So that's a quite long time ahead. The sectors we are focusing on the beginning is iron and steel, cement, fertilizers, and aluminium. A third element of importance on the ETS, and I also signaled in the introduction, is funding. And in this context, we look at two types of funding. First, there's the funding for industry to develop the new technologies needed for deep decarbonization. We have an innovation fund where at present we have 450 million allowances that we can auction in this decade, and the revenue we get from that can be invested in innovative industrial projects and innovative renewable energy projects, including carbon capture and storage. We have proposed to upscale that instrument, to add another 150 million allowances, and to the extent that free allocation would become available, or let's say the allowances wouldn't be needed anymore for free allocation, that would also, because of the CBAM mechanism, that would also be moved into the innovation fund. We also suggest to introduce a novelty to be able to, let's say, we hope kickstart faster some of the transition. And that's notably the idea of contracts for difference. With the contracts for difference, we would be organizing a kind of tender at the level of the EU, where companies can come and tender at what price they can provide a certain good. Think, for instance, about green hydrogen. And then the least cost supplier will receive the contract under the innovation fund. But important here is that we would also increase the allowed amount of, or let's say the increased allowed percentage of what we pay. At present, the innovation fund can only pay 60% of the additional cost of the innovation. Under those contracts for difference, as we have proposed, we would be able to do that up to 100%, and we think that will facilitate, to some extent, the rollout. Furthermore, that's more looking at the side of member states and the differences of capacities in the EU between member states to act. There is also a modernization fund under the ETS, where basically a number of allowances that normally flow to member states are distributed to a fund to help low-income member states, and also there we propose to have an increase. To finalize the summary of policies that directly reflect greenhouse gas emissions, I would like to stress that there is not only an ETS. It is not only industry that has limitations. All sectors in the EU, in the end, are covered by EU legislation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For the sectors outside of the ETS that emit, this is called by us the effort sharing regulation. The effort sharing regulation defines national greenhouse gas targets for emission reductions outside of the existing ETS. So think about transport, road transport in this case, because we would have maritime and aviation into the existing ETS. It covers buildings, it covers agriculture emissions, and it covers waste and small industry. That target is actually distributed between member states based on capacity, with our highest income member states having the highest absolute target and our lowest income member states having still a reduction target, but one that is less high in total. We furthermore propose to create a new ETS to assist member states achieving these targets, but that new ETS would in the beginning be separate from the existing ETS, and it would cover basically the energy emissions of transport and buildings. Finally, there's the land use change and forestry, abbreviated by LULUCF, regulation that controls all the emissions we store in our trees and in our soil. To the extent that you manage to grow more trees, you will actually be storing carbon from the atmosphere. To the extent that you harvest more your forest or plow more your fields, you will disturb the soil and you will release emissions into the atmosphere. Europe is presently in total a sink. That means we are absorbing more in our natural environment than we are emitting. But that sink is decreasing in size. It's basically going the wrong direction. In this land use change and forestry regulation, we've introduced an increased ambition spread over the countries based on the size of their territory to increase the sink. So they will need to develop proactive policies to increase the carbon uptake in forest and in soil. And as I said, that is needed over time to deliver gradually to this increased amount of removals to become climate neutral in total. The Renewable Energy Directive, also a directive that I think is of importance for the port. It has a number of features, but I think the most notable one are targets. There are targets set at the EU level to be translated by member states bottom-up in national targets. What we had proposed is to move towards a 40% renewable energy target by 2030 because of what's happening right now in the crisis in Russia, Ukraine, and the consequences of that for our energy market, and the need to switch away from Russian fossil fuel imports. We've actually proposed now to strengthen that to 45% to compensate for that impact. It has a number of sectoral sub-targets, and I think, again, an important one there is transport, but also what we call the RNFBO, which is the renewable fuels from non-biological origin. It's a very complicated word for basically hydrogen and its derivatives, where we have proposed and a sub-target in transport of 2.6%, which we suggest actually to increase now because of the energy crisis, and a target in industry for those applications that are using hydrogen to go towards 50%, and there also we are proposing to increase it because of the energy crisis right now. But anyway, that we would have a deep penetration already of green hydrogen coming into our industrial complex. Another important feature of that directive, I would say, is the facilitation. Making sure the permitting processes work, making sure countries talk to each other so they plan ahead how their renewables will interact, even making investments across borders. Also, that is all being updated in the proposed legislation. And for permitting, maybe to stress, and I'll come back to that briefly at the end, to address the need to phase out fossil fuel imports from Russia, we've come out with a set of policies called Repower EU. Again, I'll come back to that. But an important part there is the stress and focus on how to improve and smoothen permitting procedures, including the proposal by us to go to go-to areas where member states would proactively define areas on their land and in the sea where renewable projects development can then subsequently be done, let's say, more smoothly once the go-to areas are defined. A slide on what the Fit for 55 package means for waterborne transport, trying to summarize the main hooks to the waterborne part of the port. As I already introduced, the extension of the existing ETS system to the maritime sector. Also, changes in the Energy Tax Directive are proposed, that the exemptions, notably for domestic or intra-EU fuel towards energy taxes, is removed, so that it becomes a sector that is taxed in a comparable way to all transport sectors. Exemptions there, different rates for different fuels, so the faster you can go green, the less that would apply. And for instance, the possibility to exempt electricity, onshore electricity, from that rule. We have already, but again there an update, proposed legislation around the need to provide by the government of infrastructure for alternative fuels. And here for the port, the main elements are the power supply system to be present by 2030, and the need to foresee LNG refueling points, and also the need to foresee a plan to think about other green fuels, think about hydrogen, ammonia as an example. Energy Efficiency Directive and Renewable Energy Directive, just to say that it covers to some extent also the maritime sector, so they are part of the overall economy-wide ambition level. And then finally, Fuel EU Maritime. Fuel EU Maritime is a policy that impacts, one could say, supply-demand of the fuels. An ETS, which puts a carbon price on the whole emissions of a fleet, will, of course, also intensifies the switch of fuels, but will have also a big focus on improving the overall efficiency of the shipping system, as such reducing energy consumption and emissions. This policy is only and specifically focused on the greenhouse gas intensity of the fuel carrier. We introduce a system starting in 2025 with a requirement to have a 2% improvement of the GHG intensity, going to 75% GHG intensity improvements by 2050. The proposal also has the requirement to start using onshore power supply for the highest energy consuming ships. There are elements to reward early action, including the possibility to pool. So if you manage to switch one ship fully to climate neutral, you can, in a way, make a bigger part of your fleet compliant with this regulation, exactly stimulating this kind of deep decarbonization also in the shipping sector. Very briefly, because it is a quite extensive set of proposals, here is the list. As I said already, we are confronted with an energy crisis. We are confronted with specifically reliance to fossil fuel imports from Russia, which we would like to decrease fast. For that, the Commission came forward with the Repower EU package, and as you see, a long list of policies. I won't have the time today to go into detail, but I could sketch what are the main building blocks. On the one hand, it's energy savings, because if we save more, we need to import more, we need to import less energy. And there you will find specific provisions, for instance, on buildings, trying to see more energy efficiency savings in buildings. Also a focus on short-term behavioral change, which we think can make a difference on energy consumption. We have a section on greening of the energy system. That's basically looking at where we can even faster make the transformation towards green energy. We have a solar strategy. We have a focus on hydrogen with the ambition to go even for higher shares of hydrogen, going up to 10 million tons of domestically produced green hydrogen by 2030 and 10 million tons of imported. As I said, an important part is permitting, facilitating the easier permitting of renewables projects. And then a third compartment is diversifying energy supplies. There we are proposing to create an EU energy platform, which is basically a place where we will come together with member states to discuss the coordination of that switch away from fossil fuel imports from Russia. The possibility to see if member states want to do mutual purchasing agreements. And potentially we're also looking at that organized by the EU level, but that is still being looked at. Finally, smart investment. There's one more point important in the infrastructure, is that we have looked at what it requires as new and additional infrastructure in the existing fossil fuels. And I think that's quite important. We come to the conclusion that it's quite limited there. Certainly for natural gas, we've seen important development over the last decade to improve the security of our gas system inside the EU. And we are, in the end, seeing only the need for a quite limited amount of additional investments in this context, estimated at a cost of around 10 billion euro, which is important because the total additional investment needs, which we estimate at 210 million, they're clearly coming, most of them, from the renewable energy side and the energy efficiency side. That's why we need to think about smart investment. From the EU side, we are looking at our own tools to help member states make that transition. And in that context, we have proposed to strengthen the RRF, the Recovery and Resilience Fund, and to create specific windows focused on issues of importance for Repower EU. But I'll keep it there. I'm pretty sure that I'm over time. But the conclusion is, First, and that's important, we want to put ourselves on track to become climate neutral by 2050. Fit for 55 is the comprehensive package covering basically the whole of the economy with very different types of measures to achieve so. Repower EU confronts the current crisis, but our conclusion is that that does not endanger that transition, and actually in certain fields, as I said, when it comes to the rapid deployment of renewables and energy savings, it even strengthens it. Thank you very much.
Tom, thank you very much. It was really enlightening, a little bit technical, but it was. I loved how you make it sound, well, hopeful and doable. Okay, we are going to elaborate on that in a sec. But first, ladies and gentlemen, I have to apologize for a small technical problem that we've had during the first keynote speaker. But I can assure you, you can have a look at it again online after this session. May I remember you also that you can ask your questions for the panelists as well. So please do use that Q&A button once more. I like it very much. Not the chat function, the Q&A button. And then I will take your questions with me for this panel debate. Well, I have to introduce you guys. Welcome, all four of you. Tom, we know you already because you elaborated in your keynote. Then we have online with us Simon Bergulf, Senior Director, Public and Regulatory Affairs of Maersk. Welcome. Can you hear me well? Hi, Simon. Yeah, you can hear me. I can't hear you. I think the technical crew is arranging that one. We go for, yes, now it's working. Hi, Simon, once again. Okay, then we have Wouter Bleukx, Business Director, Hydrogen at INEOS. Business Director, Hydrogen.
Yes.
I come back to that later. Okay, and then the last one is Stefan Windel, CEO at the Colruyt Group Energy. Welcome, gentlemen. I have no ladies in the panel. Well, that's a pity, but for the rest, I have a lot of brains here, that I can see. Okay, when I've heard Jos in the first keynote, it was very simple. He said, get rid of the fossil fuels. And perhaps I start with you. How are you going to do that with INEOS? How do you get rid of the fossil fuels?
That's a good question. So first of all, INEOS, but I think the full chemical industry, we support the Green Deal, we support Fit for 55, and all chemical companies are making their roadmaps in order to be able to be carbon neutral by 2050. But I think we have to make a difference between the use of fossil fuels as an energy source or the use of fossil fuels as a raw material source. Yeah? So yes, we are working on electrification in order to decrease the CO2 footprint in our companies, but we are also using fossil fuels as a raw material to make products. I just give you a simple example. We use or consume a lot of ethylene. Ethylene is made from fossil fuels. This ethylene is, for instance, used to make PVC, and everybody knows PVC from the windows or from the grey tubes. These windows go in a house for 30 to 50 years, and afterwards they are taken out, recycled, and used again. We don't see any problem with the use of fossil fuels as raw materials and working on recyclability, circular economy, and using these fossil fuels as a raw material.
We have to get better at that one because this using it as a raw material, it requires more recyclement, more, well, a pure material afterwards, and we're not quite there, are we?
Yes, but you would be surprised how many initiatives are already taken. Just to give you the same example of PVC, they have started a recycling program already more than 10 years ago. And just only in Europe, this year, we recycled 800,000 tons of PVC window frames and tubes, and to reuse them again. So, and every year, this amount is increasing. So there are quite a lot of initiatives taken by the chemical companies and also by INEOS themselves. Today we announced also a cooperation between INEOS Styrolution and INDAVER to increase the reuse of raw materials. So now on recycling, companies are working very hard on that.
Okay, Stefan, perhaps I ask you, because Colruyt Group is very well known as being a front runner. Where did you start to get rid of these fossil fuels?
Well, we started already back in the 90s. Beginning of the 90s, we had a first environmental program, a full-blown environmental program, working on different levels.
In the 90s,
In
it's
the
long
90s,
before the crisis, as we know now.
I'm talking 1990, it's quite early. But in fact, mid-90s, we started producing electricity ourselves in a renewable way.
Solar energy.
Solar and wind energy.
Why did you do that? Why that choice? Because there was no need at that time.
There was a very practical reason for it. There were two reasons. In fact, we wanted to reduce the CO2 footprint of the Colruyt Group activities, Colruyt Group being a retailer. So we wanted to get down.
Why? Because there was no need, as I say.
It's really the conviction that if we don't get rid of the fossil fuels, and if we don't change our way of working and organizing our activities, everybody sees the effects that, as of today. It's climate change, it's there, it's not going to stop. So everybody has to act. We have to act on an individual level, but also on a company level. And that's a very strong belief. That's why since the 90s and even before, we started reducing our environmental footprint.
How are you looking at the Colruyt Group at this challenge of Fit for 55 that's on the table now?
Well, it's first of all, we're very happy with the strengthening of the targets and the ambition of the European Union regarding renewable energy, the whole package you have seen in the presentation. So the ambition is very high. But from a very practical perspective, we think that between the high ambition and the policies and the targets put forward and then the day-to-day practice, there is a big gap. We have a lot of promising projects, but we have projects that we can, in fact, decide to start building, but we are waiting for answers. We're waiting for clarification. Yes. We're waiting for new legislation. And that's something also in partnerships, if we discuss with other partners to go on together to change a way of using fossil fuels, for instance, in boats or in road transport, the first comment we always get is, but it's going to cost a lot of money. And it's a short-term economic reasoning, but it's logical. It always has been like this. And why is the reasoning still there? Because I think two reasons. Fossil fuels today are still in a way supported. So it's not always very visible, but we still support the fossil fuels.
Explain that a little bit, because nowadays
it's like on from a tax perspective, for instance, there's a whole set of regulation with also exemptions in it, making sure that the fossil fuel use can sustain. And that makes the consequence is that if you want to change to non-fossil, economically seen, there is a big gap. And there are a lot of initiatives to lower the gap. But I think we also have to look at the source. That's one thing. And something else we also see a lot is that to be able to grasp the details of the whole legislative body
of Fit for 55, of everything,
55 or everything,
broader.
You really need experts, and even big companies, they don't understand the real definitions and how it's all working together. And we have a lot of regulation, and maybe I think I'm a lawyer myself, but I think we have too much regulation. We should try to simplify it and make sure, okay, that's a target, that's a roadmap, and this is the regulation, and keep it quite strict. We have been discussing about the permitting procedures. We have very well defined and designed onshore wind projects in portfolio that have been put on hold for more than 10 years because rules are changing continuously, because opposition is
legislation is really very difficult. Okay, we come back to that because those are two very important points. But first of all, I want to go to Simon. Simon, hi. Maersk is very ambitious. I read online on your online site that you set a target for yourself, like in 2040, to have a zero carbon emission. That is very, very ambitious. 10 years earlier than the rest of us. Why?
Well, we had an ambition in 2050 in 2018, and in the beginning of last year, as you rightfully pointed out, we accelerated that. So not only did we move it to 2040 across the whole business, so that means not just shipping, but everything that we do in Maersk, including our logistics and warehousing, for example. But also decided that we would no longer purchase any fleet or any vessels that would not be capable of sailing on renewable fuels. So that was a very conscious choice. The reason of 2040 is actually relatively simple in the sense that it was analyzed on a science-based target initiative aligned path, and it was what was needed to actually align us with the Paris targets. But beyond that, there is also a certain degree of, there's a big difference. Those 10 years mean a big difference. 2040 is closer to us now than the year 2000. And I'm old enough to remember, everything about the year 2000 and the bug of the millennium, et cetera, et cetera. So 2040 is something that is so close to us that it actually enables a far better understanding, but also motivation inside the company to get things done. So that is why we moved that target.
When you look at this Fit for 55 target that we put for ourselves, no, it's Europe that put it for us, but it's not enough then, because it's only, 10 years before your 2040, and then you're a really completely zero emission company. So how do you look at the Fit for 55? How can it help you to get this target for 2040?
So the Fit for 55, when it comes to specifically what Maersk is looking at, is actually built up, and Mr. Van Ierland actually defined that in his very good presentation. But for us, we have these three main elements that constitute this regulatory triangle, where you have the Renewable Energy Directive, the FuelEU Maritime, and the Emission Trading System. And that triangle is extremely solid if you want to decarbonize shipping. So as such, you have all the right tools in there. What you then need to do is make sure that you don't miss one of them, that one doesn't disappear, and that they are talking to each other. So we absolutely need the Fit for 55 and this triangle to be a success. We also need that as Maersk, because yes, we do have a target in 2040, but we also are in a situation where we need to compete on a level playing field. And that means that we can have our own target, but we also need our competitors, we also need the rest of the shipping companies to reach the level that is needed, and so that we can compete with them on an equal footing.
I come back to the level playing field later, but first of all, I want to begin on these two elements that I heard from Stefan Wouter. I saw you nodding when he was talking about, this legislation is very, very difficult to cope with it. How do you see it at INEOS? Because INEOS, perhaps I should say, in 29 countries you're active. So you're a really, really big company. So how do you look at it?
So on one hand, of course, we need legislation, and it's important to have a very clear framework. And there I agree with Stefan. It is not always, the legislation is not always clear and not always in time. That is the first problem. I just give you maybe a very simple example. Together with the Port of Antwerp and other partners, we are developing green methanol. And green methanol could be used, for instance, by Maersk as a fuel, or can be used as a raw material to produce more green molecules. Due to the fact that the legislation is not clear, we have decided not to produce it as a green fuel, because the legislation is not clear today, in order to be able to develop that.
So you cannot invest, you cannot support the innovation that is needed just because, our politicians aren't ready.
We have to take an investment decision this year if we want to have that demonstration plan developed in 2024, because you need to know that all these projects take at least 2-3 years to develop, and we need to take a decision today, otherwise we have nothing in 2024. So that's why we have said, okay, we will not develop it for the fuel perspective, but we will develop it as a raw material, which is a pity, because we would like to work together with companies like the shipping industry to develop these products, but we are not able today.
Simon, you recognize that. I see you nodding on the screen.
Yeah, I mean, green methanol is an extremely good example, and as just was stated, we've just invested in one small ship that will be a feeder ship that will sail on green methanol already from next year, but then a series of 12 ships that are going to come in 24 and 25 that also will sail on green methanol. And I recognize what's been said, because when we started analyzing this big package of legislation, that was the one element that we said, oh, wait a second. What about the green methanol as a fuel, right? How do we actually make sure that we reward the choices that are made there for jumping immediately to a non-fossil fuel and not having to take a transitional fuel, so to say? What I will say, however, is that in our dialogue with the European Commission and other European stakeholders, they have been very attentive to that, and they are very aware. Of course, what they need to do, what they know that they have to do is future-proof as much as possible this legislative package. which is not an easy task by any means. But it's also good, I think, that we can come to them with these specific elements. And I am at least for now reassured that green methanol will be rewarded in one way or another.
Tom, I don't want to shoot a pianist, and you're not a pianist, but you can see it's always coming back, these legislation problems. And why is it so difficult for Europe? Is it because of the nation states? What makes it so difficult to be quick and fast and make this legislation as we need it future-proof?
Okay, I think a little bit the chicken and egg here. I think Europe is fast. I think if you look at the regulatory setting that we have, and by the way, I should stress this, what I presented today are almost all updates of existing policies that are now in the co-decision process. So what I presented today, we will see what the co-legislator decides. But it looks hopeful, I would say. There are some hiccups, but by and large, there's a lot of willingness to advance this piece of legislation. In that piece of legislation, there are several of the answers that people are looking for today. There is, for instance, there would be the obligation that we can't, 2 times count an emission, while in reality it's only 1 time an emission in the ETS. So that would already be an answer to actually well, you didn't ask it as a question, but the reuse of methanol in industrial settings, if that is green methanol and if that would in the end still be released, we would have to make sure in our legislative implementation that is only in total 1 emission, as an example. Similarly, the definition of green energy fuels, the key one here, I think, because we have quite a lot, and actually on biofuels, there are discussions about how optimal they are, but by and large, we have a well-defined set of definitions of what biofuels are and what the advanced biofuels are. So there, I think, there is already a lot of regulatory certainty. Where the regulatory certainty is not provided yet is, and I think it was said today, it's green hydrogen and its derivatives. And okay, there we are now in the process of launching that. We have
in the process of launching that?
Well, we have, with the Repower EU, we've come forward with our draft legal texts, and we have asked the stakeholders for comments.
And how many years will that take before it's on the table?
Well, we have 1 week and a half to go before the public consultation ends, I think. I might be wrong, a few days here or there. And then I think it's a task
for... A few days, not a few years.
Then I think it's task for us in the Commission to get that out of the Commission as fast as possible. And then there is still a procedure for Parliament and Council to approve, but then it's adopted. So no, it's not a process of years.
Okay, but I think you mentioned, you said, what I heard Stefan say, he's a lawyer. He doesn't understand what's all in the law and what's all on the table. So it's too difficult. There has to be done something in communication for all these companies, because otherwise, well, it's perhaps possible for the big companies, but it's certainly not possible for the smaller ones.
Okay, that is the issue of regulatory simplification and how you deal with it. I do think that that's exactly what Europe to some extent provides. If you would ask today what is the best mechanism to reduce emissions at the industrial scale, I think people would agree that it's carbon pricing, and we've put that into place. There is one EU system with, I would say, quite some uniformity across the EU. So to regulate such a huge amount of emissions, which at the time was close to 50% of the emissions in the EU, and they have managed to reduce faster than the rest of the economy, so it's now closer to 40% of the remaining emissions in the EU, we have provided, I would say, for simplification. If you say, can we do it immediately for everything? No, we can only try to further streamline. And we have put initiatives on the table there. And I think, again, on permitting, there were 2 specific elements in Repower EU. One is a recommendation, and I think the important point there is that we point out that indeed there are different pieces of EU legislation requiring different elements of permitting, but nothing stops member states from bringing that all together into one procedure.
So, but that's up to the member states itself.
Well, Europe is still a place of member states.
So in INEOS, you will have to deal with 29 different things on the table.
Yes, that's a simple fact. But that is not only in this case, that's for many things the case, and that is of course not easy. But yeah, we are coping with it. If I can come back on the legislation for hydrogen, which is still in development, I think the legislation for green hydrogen, it's important that it comes, and we are fully supporting that.
It's not a matter of years, I've heard.
No,
Tom said it.
That's positive. But what we need to be careful of is that we do not make that legislation so restrictive that we are not able to develop the market.
It must be flexible, you say, but that's very difficult for...
There must be flexibility and there must be a transition period. I think that is important, and the transition period needs to be long enough. What we need to do is we need to develop the supply and we need to develop the market, the demand. And both partners want, but we need to have some transition period in order to be able to develop the technology, to make the products cheaper, because today green hydrogen is still a very expensive product. It's very good. It is CO2 neutral. It will help to decarbonize, but it is still expensive. And in order to make the technological evolution, we need some time.
Yeah.
If we are making it too restrictive...
Are we talking about? What time period are you referring to?
I think we need at least 10 years. Yeah?
10 years?
Yes.
Of transition period?
Of transition period,
so
in order to develop that market.
Now, because in 2030 we have to be ready for, well, yes. Fit for 55.
I think you can compare it with the windmills, yeah. and I think Stefan is much better placed to talk about that. In the beginning, we had to support the windmills for the investment, and we had to support the electricity. Today, the windmills, the technology has improved. They are much bigger, and they have a business case on their own.
Stefan,
today.
You want to add something?
Yeah, I fully agree, but it's about the timing. If you want to get there by 2030 and really realize those targets, we have to start today. And yes. Starting today, it means like INEOS, but our company also, we have really the projects there. But if you decide to invest, they're not built the next month. It will take some time. So, like the first green hydrogen project we have in the portfolio, it's in the port of Antwerp-Bruges.
Antwerp-Bruges, yes.
Operations foreseen by 2024. So it takes some time, and we want to do it in a very good way because we want to have a reliable quality, the quantities, and a good production cost to be able to launch the market. But it takes time. And if you have to decide and put your equity in it, but you're still not sure about the legislation and the regulatory framework, it's very, very difficult.
So how are you coping with it? Because I have the feeling everybody is convinced we need this Fit for 55, we need to change, but we're hesitating because we have to put our money in it. And so how do you do that?
Well, we have the comfort of belonging to Colruyt Group is the shareholder of Vira. From the first windmill, now there is a holding company called Vira Energy, with offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, and so on. 1.2 gigawatts of capacity already installed, with a target to 5 gigawatts. We have the advantage that we are still a family company. And that means when the family company decides for our future it's important to take the decisions, we will take the decisions. But it's at risk, huh?
Yes, it is at risk. You can say that. Simon, you were talking about a level playing field that has to be equal. What do you mean by it? Because you are doing it, but not everybody else is doing it. Not everybody else in the world, not every other company is doing it.
Yeah, it goes back to what was just said, de-risking some of the investments that are needed now because we cannot wait. I mean, we've reached a tipping point not only from a climate perspective, but also very much from an industry perspective. So now the investments are coming. The ships are being built. The investments, we're talking in the billion of dollars investments, right? So now we need to protect and de-risk those investments. And by doing that, we actually need to make sure that we're competing on a level playing field between the fossil fuels and the renewable fuels. And yes, the carbon price is absolutely the best tool to do that in combination, as I said, with the two other elements of the regulatory triangle. But that is actually what we are looking at a substantial carbon price to actually make sure that green methanol, for example, or ammonia in the future is cost competitive.
You said, Tom, that there was a very important part of solidarity between all the countries in Europe. How can you make sure that there will be a level playing field for everybody?
Okay, I think that has all different features. So. Because your question asks many elements in the same time. If it's about solidarity in the EU, we are mainly focused on the fact that you need an upfront investment, it pays back over time, for many technologies that are out there, and we're not talking about the cutting edge as we are doing right now in this discussion, but think about the electric car, think about the heat pump, things which are starting to be cost competitive or are cost competitive, how to make sure that also lower income households and to some extent lower income member states can roll this out. Mm-hmm. That level of solidarity, we indeed have funding tools. The overall EU budget to some extent has that feature. But under the ETS, we specifically redistribute some of the allowances streams towards that. And on top of that, as I said, in the non-ETS, we do require the higher income member states to take more efforts than the lower.
But we need
but
also the companies.
Yes, the level playing field here works in a different way. That is that all companies in the EU are treated equally. Mm-hmm. And that is exactly what the emission trading system does. The emission trading system allows all companies to compete when it comes down to carbon in the same way in the EU.
But only within the European Union.
Yes.
We are not living alone. We are living in a global world.
Indeed, and that is why we have started with a system where you get a free allocation based on the best producer out there. Yeah. If you are that best producer, the carbon price is in a way not affecting you because you get an allowances amount equal to your required emissions. Instead, if you indeed are not at that level, you will pay for a part of your emissions, but only a part. So it works on the margin. As an economist, you know that triggers change, but as a whole, it doesn't affect your whole portfolio. Additionally, as I said, we do want to change that. We do realize that the toolbox needs to be enhanced, and that's why we are creating the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and that would put an import at full equal footing to an EU-produced product.
Okay, I'm going to the questions of the audience because there are a lot of questions. What economical gap is between hydrogen and fossil fuel? Perhaps, I don't know, Wouter, Stefan?
The economical gap today is still big. Like we just discussed, producing green hydrogen is not cheap, and all the business cases that we have today are not economic, very clear. Mm-hmm. But we are also a private company. We still believe in the long-term future of green hydrogen, and that's why we have decided as a kind of risk investment to say, yes, we already go and make some of these, we take some of these initiatives in order to get the thing moving.
Yeah, but as a risk investment.
But it is still a risk investment today, yeah? But because we believe in the future of this product. What can help us in the first instance? First of all, it would be good if we get some equity funding or capex funding, and if there could be a system of contract for difference, where a part of the difference between the use of fossil fuel versus a green alternative could be compensated. This could help to develop the first projects, again, until the technology develops, things become cheaper, and then we can phase that out.
Okay, Simon, I have a question for you. Question for Maersk. How do you avoid green methanol combustion is not releasing postponed fossil CO2? Is the green methanol you're talking about made of green hydrogen and non-fossil CO2?
It is. And it's thanks for the excellent question. Yes, I mean, we have to put the bar pretty high when we're launching this. So we are definitely talking about green methanol that is based on renewable electricity, on renewable green electricity, and what we call biogenic CO2. As these discussions become more and more complicated, we also start to realize that not all CO2 is created equal. And as such, we will not be using fossil CO2 to create a green methanol, because of course, as you know, methanol still has a carbon molecule in it and emits carbon when it's burned. So that's why it will not be a net zero fuel unless we use biogenic CO2. And that goes to the certification of this type of fuels, which is extremely important as well. And where we cannot end up in a situation whereby the legislation that is put forward is just moving, the CO2 from combustion to production. And that is one of the elements where there is a lack right now, in our belief, in what is put on the table for certain of the elements. And it is a life cycle assessment element that is not 100% clear. It is in the FuelEU Maritime, but there's still some work needed in the ETS in that. And also, if I may add to that, the point, we need also to make sure that we talk CO2 equivalent and not just CO2. So we not end up just in a situation whereby, as was said previously, we invest heavily in one type of technology just to find out afterwards that it actually emits much worse greenhouse gas emissions than what we had before.
I have, because you're talking about it, you gave the answer a little bit. I give you the next question as well. What are your thoughts on EU ETS? Do you consider there's a risk for competition distortion and business leakage for the EU?
It's a good question, and you know the Maersk position has been from the very beginning that that we should be very careful on how we impose extraterritoriality on the maritime ETS, specifically for ships that are flagged outside of the EU and calling Europe. So from the beginning, we actually had hoped that we would take a stage approach, which would be the same as was done with aviation, and allow the IMO to come forward with a global market-based measure. That was not the choice that's being made. So frankly, we get a lot of questions as Maersk from some of our customers, from others outside of the European Union that are trying to understand exactly the impact that this will have. But we also do get a lot of questions, frankly, from our competitors based outside of the European Union. So it's definitely not an easy pathway for them to understand how this will work, how it will be implemented, and how it will be enforced.
Okay. Stefan, I come to you. What hydrogen alternative will be considered major choice? How do you look at it? I come to Wouter as well afterwards.
I didn't get a question.
What hydrogen alternative will be considered the major choice? Which one is the best?
But I want to answer in a pragmatical way. We have a lot of discussion on the type of hydrogen used. The green hydrogen. We have all the colors. Yes. We have a lot of discussion going on of should it be electrons or molecules. To my opinion, it's really it's a theoretical discussion. 2030, it's tomorrow. So if we want to get rid of the fossil fuels, I'm coming back to the fossil fuels, we will need the hydrogen. And maybe for the time being, we need to approach it in a pragmatic way and make sure that the applications are there. Because the trucks, now I'm going from the ships to the trucks now it's dominantly diesel. If we want to step away from diesel trucks, we will need battery electric, but also hydrogen trucks, because not every use case is the same. But if we want to get them on the roads, we will need hydrogen. And then maybe for a few years, we don't have to be too strict. But it's a build-up. It should be a roadmap. So in the long run, it has to be completely renewable, yes. But the way to reach it, I think we have to
take it step by step,
step by step, pragmatical, and make sure that the applications are there.
Wouter?
I can only confirm. I think we should absolutely get rid of the colors of hydrogen. Yeah.
No colors of hydrogen, just hydrogen.
No, we should talk about low carbon hydrogen, define the carbon intensity and have a certain threshold, because that is the most important thing. What we want to do is to reduce the carbon, yeah? And then if it is then green, pink or yellow, doesn't matter. We need to talk about what is the content, the carbon content of that hydrogen. But again, I agree with Stefan, we need to have a transition period. Again, because we need to develop the market, we need to create the trust. And that's why we need to stimulate the use of hydrogen. And if that hydrogen is then perfectly green or light green in the beginning, it doesn't matter. Yes, in the future, it should be dark green. But at this moment, to stimulate the demand, to stimulate the developments, we should start with hydrogen as such.
Okay, last question, last very brief round. When you look at our companies here in Europe, how fit are we for 55?
Oh.
Very brief.
Fit.
Very fit. We're ready.
But ambitious.
But we will reach that point to be fit for 55. We are in 2030, we're ready.
In principle, the technology and the economic situation should allow us to make that transition, yes.
Okay, Simon?
We have no choice. It's as simple as that. This is a matter of survival also as a company, right? You know, you cannot end up in a situation where you're sitting on your hands and you're not doing anything.
Yeah.
So we are getting fitter. I'm sure we'll get there.
You're getting fitter. That's a diplomatic answer. Wouter, on the level now, where are you on the road to fit for 55 now? 60%, 70%?
We are fit, let's say it like that. Again, sustainability fit for 55, it's not a buzzword anymore. It is really part of strategy of companies. In our company, we are now talking 50-60% of the time just about sustainability. And that shows how well it is incorporated in the corporate culture in the meantime. The plans are there, we are rolling out the plans, and yes, we will be there by 2030 2030 in the first phase and by 2050 in the second phase.
Stefan,
Absolutely.
last question.
Very fit, I would say.
Very fit.
Very fit.
Are you going to reach that target, Fit for 55?
I think it's feasible, yeah.
It's feasible, not easy, but feasible.
But not wait for 3-4 years anymore.
Not wait for 2-3 years. Thank you very much. You were a wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Didier van Osselaar, good afternoon. I was talking in Dutch with all the languages compared.
Can be forgiven.
Combined. Okay, you're the Sustainable Transition Manager of Port of Antwerp-Bruges. Well, that's a mouthful as a title. What are you doing?
My role, or actually the role of my team, it's not a one-person effort, of course, is twofold. First of all, it's drafting a dynamic, future-proof transition mission strategy.
Yeah.
Ensuring.
How do you put it in a strategy? Because you have your own Fit for 55 plan then?
We have quite a broad scope of ambitions, of projects on the map to ensure that we are at least on track for Fit for 55 with the Port of Antwerp.
At least you're even more ambitious than Europe is.
A lot of our projects are in the pipeline, indeed, to ensure security of renewable energy supply.
Yeah, but you said it's twofold, your position.
Indeed, and I think the other mission of my team is to gather forces, to gather colleagues, but more important, to gather parties such as the panelists we've seen, to take joint action. Action, of course, is what will save the climate. That is exactly what is needed, and combining forces will be key.
Yeah, combining forces, we've heard it yesterday also, that you can't do it alone anymore. We've heard it from the two keynote speakers as well. We are in it together. But when I heard here, they were worried, this industry is worried about this level playing field. How are you coping with it within the context of Port of Antwerp-Bruges? How do you get all the companies in the same direction, on the same train?
Indeed, the level playing field was one of these elements I had also noted down from the panel, is a concern. Most of our companies are operating in global or European markets, and they have to ensure, of course, their competitiveness.
Yes.
What we as a Port of Antwerp, of course, can do is to ensure that there is a secure and a competitive supply of energy in whatever form is fit for purpose for our companies and of feedstocks.
Yeah.
To ensure that the infrastructure is there for those companies to tap into these new forms of energy and feedstock.
And as a port authority, can you ensure that? Because you have all these crises. Are you sure that you can be able to provide this environment, this energy that your companies need?
Are we sure? Can we ever be sure? We can only be ambitious on the one hand, and what we of course can do is ensure a good strategy that is made up in combination with our companies and in combination, of course, with our policymakers.
Yes, we were talking about the industry, how they are ready for Fit for 55. Can you translate that in the context of Port of Antwerp-Bruges? How do you get ready for Fit for 55?
Do you mean ourselves as a Port of Antwerp-Bruges organization, or do you mean a platform?
Both, as a platform and as Port of Antwerp-Bruges.
Yeah, we for ourselves, of course, we can invest wherever we see that the market needs investment in infrastructure, investment in innovative projects and pilots. We can ensure that there's a solid cooperation with other ports, with other managers of infrastructure, again, to ensure that this future-proof infrastructure is there.
Yes. Can you give us some concrete examples of these innovative projects you're talking about?
One of them, for instance, is Antwerp at Sea. Antwerp at Sea, a project supported by the European Commission through the Innovation Fund. CAPEX support was one of these leverages that was already mentioned. Sort of a horse medicine to lower our CO2 emissions very rapidly by 2030. There's our hydrogen import coalition. We can source renewable energy from wind turbines and solar panels within the Union, within Belgium. But of course, if we want to get the job done, if we want to be climate neutral at the latest in 2050, if we want to achieve the Fit for 55 targets, then we will need a robust set of options to have the energy available.
Yes.
That can be power, electricity, but it can surely also be hydrogen. Hydrogen that can be brought to us by pipelines. But hydrogen, as the Germans put it, shipping the sunshine.
Shipping the sunshine,
it's
that's
a
nice.
Beautiful phrase indeed.
Yes.
That can allow us to bring in renewable energy, wind and sun, from other continents that are blessed with vast amounts of energy and space.
I think you have a slide on that, how you are going to organize that, no?
Yeah.
Can we have the slide? We have a look at the slide. This is it, green energy hub of the future, because that's what you want to be, like a real hub, green energy hub. It's what Jacques Vermeer said yesterday as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We already are an important energy hub today, a fossil energy hub. And what we, of course, want to do is this infrastructure, this operational and commercial know-how of our vast amount of companies, and use that as leverage to become indeed that sustainable, that renewable energy hub of the future, with of course a very nice complementarity in between our Bruges platform, right at the sea, being able to import and land vast amounts of green hydrogen and hydrogen carriers, and the Port of Antwerp with its chemical cluster, with its terminal cluster, and with all the hinterland connectivity, to ensure that it can be brought to consumers in society.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been possible without this merger of the two parts, I think, to be this green energy hub of the future.
It will certainly facilitate our integrated hub proposition considerably, absolutely.
What are we seeing now? Because you have to explain at least.
Yeah, absolutely, gladly. So first of all, CO2, Antwerp at Sea, the horse medicine, getting this greenhouse gas impact downward as soon as possible.
The horse medicine.
Indeed, reducing it by 50% at least by 2030.
I like that you say always at least. You're really ambitious.
Let's see where we can get.
Yeah.
Indeed. And then there's, of course, wind and solar energy. Renewable energy is the future. That is clear. It can be brought to us in the form of power grids, electrical power. But wind and solar will, of course, also be the basis for hydrogen production.
Yeah.
To a certain extent, we can do that in Belgium in our ports.
But we haven't enough. All solar, wind energy, it isn't enough. But I think you're abroad looking for partnerships with other countries, no?
Exactly. We have our hydrogen importing coalition. We have several initiatives ongoing internationally to set up concrete projects that can start producing and exporting already this decade to the Port of Antwerp, Bruges, and to Belgium and Western Europe. The first volumes landing at our Antwerp platform. But of course, if you look at the vast amount Europe needs and needs to render renewable,
yes,
then we are talking a very big scale. And there, of course, the Bruges platform, right at the sea, with its know-how also in receiving liquefied gases, today it's LNG, is a tremendous asset.
So you will use the North Sea more as an asset, more than you do today?
Exactly, absolutely. And then, of course, the aim is to put this imported hydrogen and hydrogen carriers through to all consumers in the hinterland in the form that they need it. For instance, ammonia and methanol were already mentioned. ship owners, they want to have molecules. Let's ensure that they have those molecules that they can have their ships sailing on. Airliners, airports, they will very likely also keep flying on molecules. But let's ensure that these molecules are renewable and climate neutral.
Yes, you need to supply. Okay, tell me more about the North Sea, because when I was listening to the panel discussion, it isn't so easy to get it done, to have the laws that are needed. How are you going to do that? Because you say, well, we will be ready in a decade. We will be ready with everything that is needed. How are our politicians going on with it? Are you supported enough by national government, by Europe?
One of the things that the panelists clearly mentioned is on the one hand, the need for a future-proof policy and a future-proof set of regulations. That's clearly an important task for the Commission and our governments. But it also has to be market and investment-proof. If you say market, then you say price on the one hand, and you say product on the other hand. And of course, it has to be clear for investors exactly what kind of products that will be allowed, that are okay for this future market being sculpted by policy and by regulations.
Yeah.
And price. We need to close the gap in between what the green energy, the green molecules have to cost to make a business case fly on the one hand, and what consumers are able to pay at the other hand. Yeah. And certainly in the years to come, this will be a challenge. And I think Tom already mentioned contracting for difference. And there, of course, European Commission or member states for a certain number of years can close that commercial gap in order for the investments to actually be taken.
Your job is to look at this innovation and then see that it is done, that there is a strategy, a plan on the table. What are the biggest hurdles that you see for the next coming years for Port of Antwerp-Bruges?
I think it's really number one. Absolutely, is market. Without going to in a repetition, we really need a workable set of European directives and regulations, and you cannot underestimate how complex the bulk of regulations is that have a direct or indirect influence on markets.
Everybody says. Yeah. So.
And I think for a reason. But of course, it's very good that the Commission was aboard of the panel, to say it in harbour terms, and is in full dialogue with ambitious commercial operators, just to ensure that the policy and the regulations we draft is workable and gives trust to the market to start shifting and investing.
You can see that it's changing. They are reaching out really to the companies as well. I'm going to the questions of the audience. For shipping companies, shore power is also important. And the idea of multi-fuel port, are you working on these topics as well?
Yes, absolutely. Shore power, of course, very interesting to lower the threshold towards tapping into renewable energy on the one hand, to making sure also that there are no air emissions anymore when ships are at berth. So really a win-win measure for air quality as well as climate. Absolutely. And then multi-fuel port, one of the things we can do, of course, is ensure that when a shipping company wants to bunker sustainable fuels in the port of Antwerp, be it hydrogen or ammonia or methanol, that they can easily do so.
Yeah, that it's possible.
And that is exactly the aim to have by 2025, so quite in near future. Tomorrow, as we speak, indeed, to ensure that those fuels can be bunkered in the Port of Antwerp.
Okay. Yeah. What is, according to you, the role of the port has to play? Aren't it the private companies that have to make the shift? How are you going to convince them? We were talking a little bit about that before, but how...
I think it's up to us to make sure that the context in which the nearly 1,000 companies, concession holders that we have, that the context is right for them in order to shift and to invest in the sustainable processes, the sustainable transportation modes. The regulatory context, the infrastructure context.
So you're a facilitator.
Absolutely. And perhaps also a community builder.
Yes.
We can bring
some sort of
companies-
ambassador.
Ambassador, but perhaps more than that, forging partnerships, ensuring that companies lay all the components together that are needed to create future-proof, integrated business models and concepts. Companies, but I think the same thing goes also for public cooperation. Let's cooperate as member states. Let's cooperate as ports.
So the port authorities are facilitators and community builders.
Exactly.
Okay. How to avoid more expensive and more climate-polluting American shale gas? We would go backward when using more GHG-intensive shale gas in place of conventional Russian gas.
It's quite a challenge, I think, to find the right balance under the pressure of the Russia crisis.
The war in Ukraine. Yes.
Yeah. It will be a balance. Yes, let's try and keep all the noses in the direction of the final decision, renewable energy. But yes, do allow our economy, our commercial operators to find workable alternatives.
Yes. Well, I have to go to the conclusions because you followed the whole session and you heard the two keynote speakers, you had a panel discussion. What are your three key takeaways? I'm saying key takeaways for the session to take with you for Port of Antwerp Bruges?
Okay, for me it would certainly be coming from the panel the need for a fit for purpose policy. Yes. Fit for 55, yes, but also fit for purpose. Let's ensure that companies still have trust in this European market and keep on investing in Europe. Yeah. First of all, I think partnerships. Let's try and combine forces in between companies, but also publicly and privately. Let's together determine the path forwards to ensure achieving our climate goals. And perhaps last of all, I think the panel has proven that the Port of Antwerp Bruges, with its ecosystem, with the know-how, the operational skills of the companies, can be and will be an important leverage towards the European Union and its climate goals.
Okay, you're very hopeful for the future. I've seen it, and very ambitious. Okay, thank you very much, Didier. Thank you also, my dear panel, for all the questions that I got here on my tablet. I hope you enjoyed it, that you get tons of inspiration as well. As for me, I enjoyed it a lot. I learned a lot today in this session. I will propose you to take a little break, 15 minutes, grab a coffee, stretch those legs, and then be ready and prepared for next very interesting session on the commercial outlook till 2025. As for me, I'd love to see you back in 15 minutes. Bye.